When you say the word scammer, I think everyone has a very different idea of what that looks like in their mind's eye. And I don't know if it's because I grew up in the before and after of social media. I saw the birth of the woman-focused internet influencer. But in my mind, when I think of a scammer, particularly in that space, I think of a skinny blonde white woman who is very conventionally attractive and most likely doesn't treat her kids well. Odds are she's more often than not, she's doing something morally unscrupulous around everything that is her life. And if not that, she's doing something downright illegal. And one of the stories of scammerhood that completely captivated me several years back has come back into the public conversation, which means that I have to make a video about this. I have had this person as a part of my memory bank for far too long to just keep it in there. I gotta talk about Belle Gibson. I was first introduced to Belle Gibson and her story, I suppose you can call it, about 6 or 7 years ago. I actually made a video where I mentioned her briefly when I had first discovered the Belle Gibson story. I think it was a Get Ready With Me or something from like 7 years ago. I had just on a whim randomly had watched a 60 Minutes Australia interview with her in it. And I remember being very fascinated by this stranger. She had this bright pink turtleneck and she was very young and glowy, and she spoke like this, and you know, she had a very high voice, but it always had a little bit of an inflection, denoted her discomfort in the story interview. And I remember before learning more about the circumstances that brought her to said interview, I even felt like she was kind of being attacked by the interviewer that was basically looking for answers from her. That is until the interview like kept going and you realize there's a very, very severe and real reason why this person is here today. And once I realized the severity and longevity of her lies, it sent me down a rabbit hole that at that point sent me down the Munchausen's rabbit hole, where I learned also about Gypsy Rose Blanchard. Shout outs, I guess. Heard she got a bob recently. Good on you, girl. I don't know. If you haven't heard of Belle Gibson, Belle Gibson is someone who is now more famous for her infamy than she was for her fame. But at one time, she was known as one of the kind of pioneers of Instagram health and wellness content creators. She talked a lot about the powers of foods and healthy diet and recipes that she would share to her followers. She would eventually make a cookbook with Penguin that was to be released internationally, and she had an app which was one of the first that would be available on the Apple Watch. She was really making a name for herself and becoming this thing that no one had really ever thought of prior to that. Someone who was able to take a following on Instagram and turn that into buyers of tangible goods. And she got very, very wealthy in the process. But the thing that Belle Gibson sold wasn't just her recipes, because honestly, I don't think anyone would buy it because Google. But what she did sell was hope, because these weren't simply just recipes to maybe get more roughage in your diet or maybe figure out a cool way to get more protein in waffles or something. Belle created an entire audience that would follow her through some of the most horrifying and tragic sounding events of her life. Because when she started her page, she would say that she had been diagnosed 4 years prior of a malignant brain tumor and was given only 4 months to live. But being that several years had passed, she was kind of a health marvel, a miracle. She had all her hair, she was bright and glowing, she looked well, she was moving, she was talking. She by no means looked like she was on death's door, even though at the time of her diagnosis, she was given at best 4 months to live. And so she would say that she was able to be this healthy not because of the marvels of modern medicine. Instead, she said she ended up doing conventional methods such as chemo, but found that it didn't help her at all. What had helped her, she would claim, is focusing on healthy foods, Gerson therapy, positive thinking, and alternative medicine. Basically, eat right, exercise, vibes, and that her recipes were just an extension of this story that she told the world. This story of survival, having autonomy in a time where she theoretically felt so hopeless and out of control. At that point, being diagnosed with such severe cancer, you really are just at its mercy. But instead, she said she was able to take actionable steps to reclaim her life. And that was very appealing to her audience, especially those that had cancer themselves. But only problem, Belle didn't have cancer. Belle never had cancer. Belle was a liar and a fraud in so many ways. And who knows to this day how many people she had hurt via her information. And till this day, she has not atoned for, apologized really, or admitted any of the lies that she told, or took accountability for the fact that those lies may have led innumerable people away from life-saving conventional methods. And it has been about 10 years since that story broke of Belle Gibson's lies, and recently, Netflix has come out with two things kind of at the same time centering around the Belle Gibson story. One is a documentary that has a name that I didn't remember because it's stupid, but I saw her face and I was like, oh my God, that's Belle Gibson. And a scripted, inspired limited series by the name of Apple Cider Vinegar. And just like that, I was sucked back into the fuck Belle Gibson rabbit hole. And as usual, anything that I get hyperfixated on becomes your problem. So today we're going to talk about that. Belle Gibson, the story of Belle Gibson, how we found out about her lies, the impact of her lies, what she's doing these days as far as we know, and also my thoughts around apple cider vinegar and just broader implications of Belle Gibson and her story through both the documentary and the scripted show. So that's gonna be today. And before we get started, I should say hello. I realized I didn't say hi. Hi, I'm Kendall. You're new around here, welcome. Not new around here, what is up, homeschooler biscuit? I hyperfixate on things. This has been a story in my mind for years, and I think each time I kind of am reminded of Belle Gibson, I have new thoughts and takeaways from it. There's very few stories that elicit such complicated emotions from me. And I think through the course of the documentary as well as the scripted show, I've been very able to feel even more varying emotions, ranging from absolute disgust and frustration and anger and bitterness, but also just deep pity and sadness. And again, as usual, that's your problem now. I'm going to talk about it. So sit back, relax, and let's go down the rabbit hole together, shall we? But first, a word from our sponsor. Hello everyone, this is Admiral Kennie, and today's video is sponsored by HelloFresh, America's #1 meal kit delivery service that offers fresh, delicious, and healthy meals, if you want it to be, straight from the comfort of your own home. Pre-portioned, pre-thought out, pre-shopped for, you can get a meal on the table in about 30 minutes, often less than that. And this morning, I woke up craving a burger, but not just any burger, baby. One of those burgers that you can only get when you make them at home. A very particular level of grease. I didn't want to be healthy today, but I didn't feel like going to the grocery store to get the stuff for it, and lo and behold, I had the stuff from HelloFresh. Hey man, it's one of them PMS burgers, you know, the ones where you just want grease and iron. It was so good. And wedges, and I got that bad boy done quick. It was beautiful. I have easy to follow recipe cards, and if you're ever in recipe ruts, it'll get you moving and doing something different, baby. They also have delicious add-ons like pre-cooked proteins, really quick lunches that you can make in like 10 minutes and not have to really cut up or prepare much. Egg bites for breakfast, desserts, a bunch of stuff, and it's all really good. So if you would like to check out HelloFresh, you can get 10 free meals and free shipping on your first box. Just go to HelloFresh.com and use code Kennie10FM. Free meals applied as discount on first box. New subscribers only. Varies by plan. It's Kennie10FM for 10 free meals and free shipping on your first box. Big thanks again to HelloFresh for sponsoring today's video. Now let's get on to the debauchery. The internet health space has long been a place full of weird and dangerous information. It has always attracted grifters and con artists, alarmists peddling their magic pill that cures whatever ails you, people who sell their particular way of eating so that you can be healthy, live longer, most likely not be fat, because there's a lot of fat phobia and that too in eating disorders, but we don't have time today. But to be healthy, quote unquote, everyone would have a very very staunch opinion on how one eats to be that way, whether it be high carb, low carb, high fat, low fat, paleo, keto, fasting, vegan, raw vegan, avoiding gluten, avoiding animal products. Honestly, if you if you listen to every person that said what you should avoid in your diet, you would eat nothing. And I think it really goes to show that more so than anything, these spaces create a deficit in you and provides the pill or the regimen that would fill that hole. I remember another grifter in this like time period. She was a few years later, but there was like the banana girl. Am I showing my age? Do people know who the banana girl is? The was telling everybody to eat bananas, like only bananas. It was a dark time. Then there's other people who are like, yeah, you can drink water with essential oils in it or take colloidal silver pills. Do neither, please. I'm so serious. Don't do either. You can get some serious health issues, including esophageal burning, damage, or turning blue. So Belle Gibson was not alone, is what I'm getting at when we talk about the conversation of grifters in the health influencer space. But she was one of the first. And if you were to just look at Belle Gibson's recipes, for instance, there was nothing in particular or groundbreaking about her recipes or her recommendation. Eat more fruits and vegetables. Groundbreaking. Focus on whole, unprocessed foods. Exercise. Pretty uncontroversial shit. But again, the thing that would bring her attention, adulation, and eventually the ire of the masses would be lying and charity fraud. But we'll get to that in a second. Belle would create her Instagram page in 2012, saying that she had been diagnosed in 2009 of an inoperable terminal brain cancer and given only 4 months to live. She would recall this in great detail, talking about how she was in a doctor's office where she would be told that she only had a few weeks to live, 4 months tops. She basically had no hope. She would do conventional methods like chemotherapy, but would find that there was no help in those. But she said that she was able to take control of her health by focusing on natural medicine, Gerson therapy, and whole foods in lieu of conventional chemotherapy. She said though she tried chemotherapy, it made her feel terrible and did nothing to cure her cancer or better her chances, and so she decided to take recovery into her own hands. Before we go into all of the disgustingness of that, I first want to take a detour and talk about Gerson therapy. Oh my God, don't listen to people supporting Gerson therapy. If you don't know what it is, if you're lucky enough to have never heard of it, it is essentially a health protocol where you heal yourself, often from terminal illnesses like cancer, with juices and taking a ton of coffee enemas a day. Often it's said that you should do this in lieu of more conventional and well-researched treatments such as chemotherapy or other forms of treatment, and instead just drink a bunch of juice and shit a lot, and that will cure you of cancer. I hope I don't have to say this, but that's bullshit. That's not how that works. Please go to a doctor, go to an oncologist, please. And it's also incredibly disgusting to sell a protocol that A, will not cure cancer, but B, if you wanted to drink a bunch of juice, you don't have to get off of chemotherapy to do so, as far as I understand it. You can drink as much juice as you want and still go to a doctor. But the fact that this alternative is pushed upon already scared and desperate people who are looking to find another way when they have cancer, the fact that you will sell that and dissuade them from going to get actual help is up, but very, very common, unfortunately, in this space, especially at this time. Belle would say that Gerson therapy, as well as, again, whole foods and alternative medicines, would be what would ultimately have her standing and writing today, 4 years post her diagnosis. But just because she was still alive 4 years later didn't mean that her posts didn't often recount the struggles of maintaining her health. She would talk of the pain she was going through sometimes. Later, talking about how the cancer would inevitably spread despite all her best efforts. But ultimately, she was selling this way of life via a cookbook and her app to say that it was the reason why she was standing today. At the time of the release of her app and book in 2014, Belle would say that she had been stable with her cancer for about 2 years. Eventually, though, as it seemed her profile and her book and her app began to get more scrutiny and become bigger, so too did the cancer. She would eventually say to her followers who were tethered to her by way of their own stories, but also going with her through the darkest times that she recounted on Instagram. She would go to them and tell them that her cancer, that she again had been stable from for about 2 years, had now spread to her liver, her kidneys, her blood, spleen, and uterus. Some say that Belle would say or claim that her health issues were as a result of a bad reaction to the HPV vaccine. If you weren't aware or hadn't noticed, there is a big crossover between the alternative medicine capitalism side of things as well as anti-vax sentiments, because both of them fundamentally fester and feed off of the often understandable distrust that many people have with the healthcare system. And if not because they had been done wrong by the healthcare system or someone they loved been done terribly by the healthcare system, just by the trauma of seeing friends and family or themselves sick and sometimes die. And even at the best hospitals, people will die. If that death is particularly painful, that stays with people. Often that hesitance or distrust of the medical system can be the result of a real or imagined negligence by a medical professional that resulted perhaps in the death of a loved one. And alternative medicine and anti-vax appeal to filling in those things that just can't be accounted for, such as sometimes people die. Anyway, again, Belle would get very, very popular through her Instagram. She would be a parasocial friend, an inspiration, and perhaps most invaluably, she was someone that understood the isolation and the pain and the frustration that cancer brings, the feeling of that loss of control. But almost as quickly as it began, all of that adulation and love that came pouring into Belle Gibson, all that sympathy that people felt for her, all of it came crashing down almost as quickly as it began. Because those who knew Belle personally, who were told that she had cancer, started to feel like something was not right. And they started talking to anybody who would listen, particularly in the media, about something just ain't right with Belle Gibson. One of the people that would start to feel like something was very weird with Belle was her own friend, a girl named Chanel, who would say that she had noticed things about Belle, noticed that for a person suffering from cancer, she seemed to be drinking a lot and she seemed to be partying a lot. She seemed to be, being that she was this big like health guru basically online, she seemed to be living a pretty unhealthy life when she could see it. But the thing that kind of sent her over the edge is when she saw Belle have a seizure at her son's birthday party. Chanel would say that she saw her on the floor. She was saliva coming out of her mouth, just a thrashing. And she said, let's call the hospital. Like, she seems to not be okay. And seemingly, all of a sudden, Belle was fine enough to stop seething on the floor and say, no, I don't want Western medicine. I'm fine. I don't want them involved. Chanel says something ain't right with that. I don't like that. That's not. Also, as a side note, being that we already know that she's a liar, that is crazy to have a fake seizure on the floor of your 4-year-old son's birthday party. You done that child up forever. I mean, she probably did in many other ways, but goddamn. What? Anyway, eventually Chanel and a mutual friend of her and Belle's would confront Belle, asking whether or not she actually had cancer. And Belle would cry and be offended and disgusted and angry at the implication that she would lie about something as serious as cancer. It was like, who am I about that? But whenever they tried to get a straight answer, like, who's your doctor? What hospital did you go to? When did you get this diagnosis? Do you have any paperwork that says, or MRI scans that say definitively that you have this thing that you claim you have? And most importantly, and at the time, this intervention would take place the day before her cookbook the whole pantry would be released worldwide by Penguin. And Chanel would say she was trying in any way possible to get someone to listen to the fact that she should not be listened to. She could be, again, dissuading a lot of people who need care from getting the care that could give them the best probability of surviving, the best probability of more years on this earth. They are foregoing that and going for someone that they think has been able to achieve this impossible thing who had never had cancer. So, but again, Bella swore up and down she had cancer, she had cancer. So you're just a disgusting for coming into her house and saying that she doesn't. And many people didn't really listen to Chanel. She would say that she would go to authorities, she would go to different news outlets and papers to see if any of them would actually give her a chance to say her concerns. And many of them would say it was disgusting for Chanel to suggest that this young mother suffering from a terminal illness would lie about that. She was an inspiration. She was helping people. Like, you sound like a jealous hater. But luckily there was someone who was willing to talk with Chanel, and that is the Age newspaper in Australia. Essentially, the Age had started poking around. Basically, there had been some smoke in the house of Belle because Belle would say that the whole pantry and herself had donated about $300,000 to various charities. These funds were often raised through public fundraisers, and people donated under the assumption that they were giving to charities, often that supported cancer research or cancer patients. But it would be found that Belle had not given them a penny. The Age would be perhaps the first news outlet to write a negative article about Belle Gibson and about her possible charity fraud. And being that that was already the case, Chanel was more than willing to give more information that she feels as though Belle does not have cancer and has been lying about it the entire time. And after just a little bit of nudging, it don't take much to fact check. If you got any professional, oncologist, if you got any professional to look at this shit, they could tell you that's not how cancer works. The way that she talked about her cancer did not make sense. If you were to look at Belle's story without the emotional attachment to her story or the emotional feelings around your own illnesses, if you were just looking at Belle objectively and listening to her story, particularly from the lens of someone who knows maybe a little bit more than the average about cancer, I'm not saying that's me, I'm talking about the oncologist they interview. That's not how brain cancer works.
I have cancer in my blood, spleen, brain, uterus, and liver. Extremely uncommon.
And if it did work like that, she'd be dead.
The patient would be moribund. It just doesn't make any sense. But if a patient had brain cancer that was that widespread, they're not walking and talking.
She certainly wouldn't be around flying, jet setting, and selling a book and all that shit. She would be on death's door, if not dead already. Also, some of the places that she listed off are places that are very unlikely to even get cancer. And so if anyone were to look at her story and combine all these things that she swore happened to her, the chances were basically zero. Now, if you were to look in the comment sections, however, of her posts, very rarely would you see any dissent. If anything, I would suggest that she or someone she hired deleted negative comments or like responded to any questions, basically saying that you are, ye of little faith, your bad vibrations are why you're going to die of cancer. Anyway, and so now this is the first proper written dissent from Belle calling her into question, if not outright calling her a liar. So Belle thought it was a good idea to take it upon herself to defend herself via that aforementioned 60 Minutes interview. Again, in the infamous pink turtleneck. It is on my list of favorite dumpster fire interviews, up there with R. Kelly and Gayle King and the Pedo Prince. What's his name? Andrew. A mess, baby. As far as like clearing my name interviews go, it's infamous. Oh, it's a mess. Again, this was my first introduction to Belle Gibson, and she's interviewed by Tara Brown with the Bob, complimentary, and she poignantly but politely reads her for absolute filth, and not on purpose. All she does is just ask, like, how does that make sense, essentially? And you watch the crumble of Belle Gibson, because it would come to show that though she had very detailed and specified lies that we will soon find out had gone all the way back to 2009, she didn't really think of a story plan, honestly. I think the most she thought of an actual explanation introduction to her life, supposedly, was in the time that she kind of hid from the public right after the articles were released. So this was her chance to clear her name, tell her side of the story, and she did a terrible job.
I mean, in 2009 was a really bad year for you, wasn't it? You had 3 heart operations, you suffered 2 cardiac arrests, you died twice on the operating table, you had a stroke, and you were diagnosed with an inoperable brain tumour and given 4 months to live.
Correct.
It's remarkable. It's on YouTube. I highly recommend you watch it if you've never watched it. Or after this, you know, again, 60 Minutes has their money. I'm trying to make mine. By the time she is to sit down and have this interview, she has changed her story quite a bit. Now, she admits that she does not have cancer, possibly never had cancer. Instead, she is the victim of a doctor with some strange level of malintent towards her. She would say that she thought she had cancer because some doctor named Mark Johns. At one point she says she talked to some dude, Dr. Phil. Oh yeah, I talked to a doctor named Mike Black. Told me I'm gonna die. She said that a doctor, came to her home and brought out a box that was German technology, and it had 2 pads that would be used to measure the frequencies of her body and would ultimately deduce that she had horrible, inoperable, terminal brain cancer. And being that this is her new story, we have to read what the story had been before, particularly in that book she was selling to people, where she told people that she was told in a doctor's office that she had terminal cancer and that she wasn't told by some quack that came to her house. And if there was some quack that came to your house, why didn't you go to an actual doctor afterwards? Why didn't you get any actual conventional tests done? Why won't you show us any of your medical records for this interview to clear your name? And for that and many more questions, she has no answers for. Also, again, as I've talked about a little bit, she has a history of lying about her health, as we will find. Because if you look upon her internet footprint back in 2009, she was a frequenter of skater forums. This would be in her late teens. And on this forum, she would claim that she was suffering for a lot of health issues that she would ultimately be hospitalized for, receive several surgeries for, would die on the operating table more than once from.
The draining failed and I went into cardiac arrest and died for just under 3 minutes. I had the most intense bruising from the paddles when they electrocuted me back to consciousness. Anyway, the procedure failed and I died.
See, I haven't read back through all of that.
This you combine with the story she tells several years later via Instagram, which would say that also around this time that she would have more than 1 stroke, suffer seizures, and again, ultimately be diagnosed with a terminal brain cancer. And when confronted with the first set of lies, the skater forum lies, she says, well, yes, but I was in my late teens and, you know, teenagers are dramatic, especially when they've been through the trauma that I had been through.
You're young and have gone through the situation I had just gone through. You are melodramatic.
And Tara, bless her heart, is like, no, that's not what this is. This isn't being over dramatic. These are astounding lies, remarkable lies, detailed, narrative-like lies.
You claimed you died twice. You didn't. You claimed you had 2 cardiac
didn't.
arrests. You didn't. That's not melodramatic. That's straight out lying.
It is.
Extraordinary lies.
And more importantly, it shows a propensity of lying in this way. But Belle, she just can't admit she's a liar. First of all, she can't admit that shit. She would again assert that she was misled, that she did believe that she had cancer, that she had gone to get a CAT scan to look into her cancer, that test results of photos, x-rays, MRI scans of her tumor. But apparently her doctors, who no one knows and no one can find, showed her for some reason someone else's cancer screening to trick her. Just gets off on it, I guess. Interestingly enough, she would assert again that she had evidence of her getting an MRI scan and would later give those results to 60 Minutes Australia, but I don't know why, because all she did was give them the smoking gun that she had lied. She did go to the hospital to get a scan, but she didn't go for cancer. Instead, she went believing believing that she might have MS, which is something that her mother actually had, so that would make more sense to have some fear around it. But it would show that she did not have MS, and most specifically that there was nothing wrong with her brain scan at all, meaning that when she went to the hospital in 2011, she knew for a fact that she did not have brain cancer. Her brain was completely fine several years prior to her making her first post where she talked about the harrowing story of her suffering from a terminal illness. She gave them explicit evidence that she knew nothing was wrong with her, and she knew it the entire time. But that did not stop her from making her stories. It did not stop her from profiting off of them. And perhaps most disturbingly, she lied. And not just little lies. She lied. Big, long, constantly. And she didn't stop even when confronted with the very real people that were living the life that she claimed to have lived. Now, during this interview, she says, "True, I don't have cancer, but again, I thought I did. And I'm very sorry for dragging people along with the story that I was misled by," but swears that she has never been intentionally untruthful. Girl, shut the and give them people their money. But indeed, she does not give them people their damn money. She would pull a Kwame Kilpatrick. Watch that video. I don't feel like explaining to people that have no idea the deep cut on this channel. She would pull a Kwame Kilpatrick saying she's too poor to pay the fine that she would ultimately be charged with after she was found guilty of charity fraud. The courts would require her to pay $410,000, which for some reason, despite it being like 6-7 years since that judgment came down, she has not paid a cent of it, nor has she gone to jail. She's out there still not paying the mother they money. She would claim that the reason why initially she wasn't able to give money to the charities is because there were cash flow issues. You cretin. Why was charity money anywhere near the cash flow of your business, you liar? And it wasn't just like charity organizations she had basically defrauded. She had also said that she would pay for treatment for actually ill children that had cancer. There was one family in particular where their son had the brain cancer that Belle claimed that she had, and she was supposed to raise money for them, but they didn't get shit either. This Paw Patrol villain, bobblehead, you couldn't just, oh. Now, this is the general outline of the story, how Belle got found out. And one of the things that I find very interesting about the newest installations into her story, if you will, the documentary, is that it goes a bit more into, again, those people in her inner circle. Again, Chanel intimately recalls the seizure at her son's 4th birthday party. And that shit pisses me off. That poor baby has to deal with her bullshit because she didn't get attention. And now it's just the cycle that, also in the documentary, they would talk a bit more about the skater forum community that Belle was a part of. And they would basically say that there were suspicions that she had created the brain cancer story based off of someone within the forum who did actually have terminal brain cancer and would die of it. And some suspicion is that she would reach out to this person to siphon off information of that illness or stories from that illness. Like, it's all so but that's particularly wild. Like the scaring your baby, the lying about brain cancer, or the appropriating brain cancer from somebody that actually died of it, the not giving that baby that damn money. The is heinous. She needs to go to jail and then to hell. Anyway, they would also interview her stepfather. He was married, if I'm not mistaken, he was married to Belle's now deceased mother. She would die of MS in 2017. And he would be in the documentary kind of recounting these stories in a very vague and up to interpretation sort of way, the relationship between Belle and her mother and Belle and her brother. When Belle started to become in more and more scrutiny, she would claim in one of the interviews that she had taken that she had grown up in a very abusive Cinderella-esque upbringing where she was forced to care for herself as well as her severely autistic brother, take care of her mother as well because of her MS. And most of that was completely untrue. And according to her mother, Natalie, most of this was untrue, being that though, yes, she did have MS, Belle didn't have some Cinderella upbringing. She never cleaned anything, and also her brother is not autistic. They would also interview her brother, and he would also say, I am not autistic. But still, there is something that can be gleaned from the kind of vague stories that both her brother and stepfather talk about, particularly in regards to Belle and Natalie, her mother. Essentially, that Natalie struggled to parent Belle. The stepfather would say that Natalie dated a lot of abusive men prior to him, and I can only imagine if they're coming around Belle that could be very traumatizing in and of itself. Her mother's MS, maybe also she had to do some form of caretaker role, but maybe not to the extent that she kind of waxes on about. But whatever happened and to whatever extent, it was pretty clear that there was some butting of heads between Belle and her mother, and that her childhood wasn't particularly easy. I, for one, was not surprised that she would have a rough upbringing, because why else lie like this? You know what I mean? Why fabricate these fantastical stories in which you are a hero and or a victim, a survivor, someone that is the focus of attention and praise, if not to make up for a lack of those things? You know what I mean? Being that they share the kind of stories between Belle and her mother kind of vaguely, it's hard to say to what degree it was that her mother was actively abusive, or maybe she was negligent of her own doing, or because of her MS, she just physically couldn't parent her children the way that she would like to because of something completely out of her control, her illness. But for whatever reason, it was pretty clear that Natalie, as Belle got older, could not parent her. To such a degree, this is disgusting and I don't care, baby. She ended up moving in with some random old man down the street. Not a family friend, which would still be kind of weird to me, honestly. Just some dude down the street that took her in. That shit's weird. And so does the stepfather and son say that, because that shit is weird. Now, we don't know if anything happened with the old man. It ain't a good look though. He's not a relative. He's not even friends with the mama, not friends with the family, which again, still be weird. Have y'all seen Abducted in Plain Sight? Hello. Anyway, but still, the fact that it had gotten to the place that Belle was living with a random stranger and her mom seemingly was cool with it, this is something going on at that house. And maybe something happened with that man. I'm not accusing him of nothing, but he sounds like a weirdo to me. Sounds sketchy. All right. But with that said, at least within the documentary, no one explicitly accuses this unnamed older neighbor of anything. But if something happened, it wouldn't surprise me. It would sadden me deeply. I think that level of trauma could also explain around this time the beginning of her lies. She would get pregnant soon after this as well, at the age of 18, maybe. There's some discrepancies about Belle's age. She would claim that she was 3 years older than her birth certificate, claiming to have been born in 1989, but her birth certificate says 1991. She claims that it's because she's had 2 different birth certificates and her name changed several times. I wonder if that had something to do with, if that is true, assuming it's true, because who knows with Belle. But assuming that's true, I wonder if that had something to do with her mother trying to get away from abusive men and trying to escape them. Either way, because of this, Belle would speak about her age in ways that were very strange and obfuscating to people who found her overall demeanor and her story fishy. She couldn't just say her age. She'd have to say, I believe I have lived my life as if I am so-and-so age, which just compounds on that already tangible feeling that Belle is hiding things. With that said, being that she would get pregnant so young, presumably from an ex-boyfriend by the name Nathan Corbett. I don't know anything about this neighbor she was living in, but I do side-eye it. You know what I mean? I do wonder what's going on there, because you just moved in with a random dude. You're so young, you get pregnant. But this would be around the time when she actually got pregnant that she would start saying that she was suffering from all these illnesses on the skate forums, and eventually would be when she would have been diagnosed with cancer retrospectively when she gets onto Instagram. And her brother would say, I was not told that she was diagnosed with cancer. I am close with my sister, or I was. I would have known that. I should have known that. I hadn't heard boo about it. Regardless of what circumstances or trauma led to Belle lying in this, again, disturbing and concerning magnitude, her downfall was because of those lies, of her own making. With that said, that doesn't mean the mega corporations that, again, didn't just get one person to actually ask, is that how cancer works? The fact that Apple nor Penguin felt the need to fact check anything about her story is wild, but does not surprise me, because that is not why they go into business. They're not there to make sure what you said is true. They're there to sell it. With that said, around the time that Belle was promoting the book in particular, Penguin would have her do PR training. And in those moments, those people would have questions and notice inconsistencies about her story. But I guess they just felt like they were too far gone that we can't do it now. We got books to sell. We got an app is to download for $3.99. You know, it's ready to go. Shifting gears a bit, let's talk about the scripted show Apple Cider Vinegar. Like I said, it's a bit of a fictionalized, fableized version of the story of Belle Gibson, but not in the ways that are majorly important, that Belle lied about a lot of things and in a lot of ways. In many ways, they take outright quotes from her own Instagram posts and put it in the video. And they have characters that are definitely inspired by real people. But it is a scripted show, so keep that in mind, that not everything is a shot for shot perfect adaptation of even the story if we follow Belle by herself. But I figured I would take this opportunity to just talk about the show because I have so many thoughts about it. And I could really wax on a whole other 48 billion years about the show by itself because I, again, have so many thoughts. Spoilers ahead. So consider that, because I guess the whole talking about Belle Gibson is a bit of a spoiler of what's going to happen in the story of Belle Gibson, but I digress. But I figured that I would just do a bit of a review of the show and just some thoughts that I had about the show and what it adds, I guess, to the overall story and the fascination with the lies of Belle Gibson. So the show is weird in a way that is only appropriate to some degree if you think about the just absurd time in our lives that is early 2010s health influencership. Tonally, it's very fast paced, a little campy, a little kitschy, a lot of copyright pop music from 2004, but it also is very, very serious because that's also what this story very much so is. I think it does a great job of dramatizing the just absolute ludicrousness that is Belle Gibson, her incredibly performative nature. It is darkly funny in a way that, again, does give some insight on that just weird time in social media. Hindsight, am I right? It's still there, by the way. It just looks different. I think eating disorders are becoming back in style again, so woo. Anyway, but the movie does have this looming dark reality of the very real impact of Belle's lies. It's all fun and games and fairy tales and castle buying, play pretend. I think does a very good job of taking very important moments to decentralize Belle and to really focus on those people that are impacted by people like her. She wasn't the only person peddling snake oil for health and vitality at this time. Like, come on, dawn time. But it puts a face to those people that she lied to. The series does a pretty good job of decentralizing Belle for very large portions of the show, because the tragedy of Belle Gibson is less about her and the people who have full real lives impacted by cancer who were sucked into the fantasies that she created. Like, you meet the child that thought they were going to get money from the whole pantry or Belle Gibson because of their very real cancer. You see people that shift their entire way of going about treatment because of her. Also, you get some insight on perhaps what it had been like to have her as a partner or as a mother. Like, I think, again, the seizure thing that did happen. Perhaps the most compelling character for me, if not controversial, will probably be Mila. She, in many ways, superficially, is very similar to Belle in that she is an influencer. She's anti-chemo, anti-conventional medicine. She goes to like a Mexican naturopathic Gerson Therapy type retreat, going there to heal her cancer and would claim that it had done so. And then she would ultimately spread the news of that philosophy and therapy to her own audience, only for her cancer to get more aggressive despite her delusions and blind belief that her own treatment was going to save her life. Now, Mila is based off of several people, but in particular, she seems to be based off of an influencer named Jessica. I do not know how to pronounce her last name. Ainscough. She was a real person who had cancer and was recommended amputation, but decided to try natural medicines and Gerson therapy to heal herself, and would ultimately share that journey, so to speak, to her very influential and also similarly ill followers. This woman, Jessica, would die in 2015, mere days before the first expose of Belle Gibson would be released. And honestly, I could go on on for quite a while talking about Mila as a character, and particularly Mila and her family and their entire story arc throughout the show, because I have so many thoughts about it. And I think of the parts of the show that I find, at least to me, particularly compelling is that dynamic. There's so much complexity to Mila as a character, but also her relationship to her parents in particular. And though, again, she is in many ways like Belle, or I should say just as culpable as Belle in many ways, but her actually having cancer fundamentally is the distinction between her and Belle. She's not spreading alternative medicine necessarily thinking that it won't work. She's not selling lies in the sense that she doesn't believe in them as well. Right? She's not going to chemotherapy. She's taking 5 enemas a day and drinking 13 bottles of juice. She's spending exorbitant amounts of money and time doing these protocols, believing wholeheartedly that she's saving her own life and taking control of her own life, particularly because she had a lot of guilt around her diagnosis, thinking that it was something she had done, something that she had caused within herself, when sometimes, most of the time, honestly, cancer is just something that happens. And it's horrible, and it strips away autonomy, as well as it may strip away one person's looks or limbs. In this case, she was offered amputation as a treatment, or in some cases, your life. But it wasn't as if she was selling a lie that she wasn't also consuming. She wasn't selling something that she didn't believe in, right? Were the results often the same, I would imagine? Certainly. She dissuaded people from getting the medicine that may save their lives, or made it much harder for them to get that life-saving treatment. And I think that's why I find that there's so much to digest around her story, because she is the result of so many circumstances that make sense to me as to why she is the way she is. At the beginning of the show, we find out that she was diagnosed soon after the death of her grandmother, who also died of cancer. And though we don't see anything in relation to the grandmother, there's some insinuation that she had a rough time with oncologists and like healthcare providers in general. She would lose her fight with cancer, and maybe that inherently, the grief associated with that, would make Mila less than trusting of the medical system. And now she was being told that she had cancer, and that the only way to save her life would be to cut off her arm at the age of 22. And in that space, she blamed herself for her cancer, thinking again that it was something that she had done to herself, and so that it had to be something that she had to fix herself as well. It was her repentance to do these protocols, to try all the options, to heal herself. And she believed that she was healing herself. I don't think people do 5 enemas a day and don't believe it. And she believed it even when there was physical evidence that her health was failing. Even when her own mother is also diagnosed with cancer. She doesn't say to her, go get chemotherapy, go get conventional medicine. No, she says, I want to save your life. Please do this thing that has saved mine. I believe she wholeheartedly, delusionally believes that she is saving her mother and saving herself. And only when her mother drops dead does she realize that she couldn't save her and she was not saving herself. At that point, she goes to her father, who at this point had always been against the alternative medicine routes and very much so pled with his wife and pled with his daughter to do conventional means to take care of their cancer. But the mother had decided to go the alternative route, feeling too guilty that she had allowed her own daughter to take that route. And what type of mother would she be if she let her daughter do that, but not believe in it herself to do it for herself? But now he had, because of his daughter, lost his wife and may lose her soon as well. I know I said I find Camilla to be particularly interesting, but I do resonate, I think, the most with her father. He is the voice of reason, and he's constantly frustrated and pleading with his wife and his daughter to get conventional medicine, to do the things that have been researched. Ain't nobody ever cured cancer with green juice, baby. And he's fighting for his wife to see reason. And now she's dead because of his daughter, who also has cancer, whom he soon finds out has not been getting better with these things that she's been getting better with. And he may lose her as well. And I just feel this immense amount of frustration and sadness and pity. And I understand all of those emotions that he feels. But I also understand Milla's Mila's thoughts. At least I feel like I can to some degree. I feel like I can extend some empathy for the desperation, for the grasping at making sense of something that just simply doesn't. It doesn't make sense to get cancer at 22 and have to get your arm lobbed off. Not because of anything you've done. It's just that's the cards that you've been dealt. I understand trying to feel like you have some autonomy in a circumstance that is completely out of your control. It's not Camilla's fault that she got cancer, but in her mind, she must make it her fault so that is something she can fix. It wasn't her fault she had cancer, and therefore it wasn't her job to repent for it. And even if she did do something to get cancer, like smoking a fuck ton of cigarettes or being out in the sun for too long, that doesn't mean you deserve to die and not get treatment and not be given the best chance or best shot at surviving and thriving. And I feel such a deep and utter sadness because the entire time watching it, you just know she's gonna realize too late. And it breaks my heart when she goes to the doctor now at the place where she's like, okay, let's do the amputation. Let's do whatever the doctors want me to do. And at that point, it's too late. She would soon die and Mila would die. And even if I didn't know or didn't hear about Jessica, it's like watching a car crash in slow motion. Like, you know it's happening. You can feel the constant denial. And it's just so sad to watch her die, especially so needlessly, because if she would have gotten amputated, she would have had about a 90% chance of living. But with that said, Mila, the character, has a moment of an attempt at redemption to make amends for the destruction that she had caused in other people's lives and their health. Mila tells her followers that she had not been getting better, that she is actually too far gone in her cancer and that she would soon die. And in that moment, that is her redemption. That is her repentance, where she tries to right some of the wrongs that she had done before that was also too late. But Belle ain't had none of those problems. That was a monster of her own making. She doesn't have the excuse of, I felt so desperate because I was diagnosed with a serious illness. She didn't have the fear, the imminent fear of death. She doesn't have the guilt that comes along with that diagnosis. She was driven completely by her own love of a very long Instagram post, her desire to wax poetic about, you know, love and healing the body with oranges and vibes, like, and ultimately her desire for attention and money. Shit, at least Mila actually was dying of cancer, which I hate that that's how her redemption is achieved. But like, Belle ain't had none of those excuses. You just wanted some money and for people to pat you on the head and say you so loved and oh my God, I'm worried about you, which I understand is a result of its own psychological things. You, I'm sorry, I don't give. Now, I will say that there's one part of this show that I did not know wasn't completely fabricated. I thought this was a fake scene, right? Because again, it's a scripted show. There's some things that they add for drama or just to connect the story and yada, yada, yada. So I thought this was fake. No, this is apparently real. The real Belle Gibson would go to Jessica's funeral. And in the show, Belle Gibson would go to Mila's funeral and would break out into loud, distracting, and uncontrollable sobs. And people would say about the real Belle Gibson that it seemed like she wanted to cry just so that she was seen more devastated than anyone else, which is very strange because they weren't close. They were not close. And in the show, there's a moment where Belle goes through her home, like through her room, like Mila's room, just looking at her shit like she's trying to siphon off the personality of the girl that died of cancer. It's weird. It's very weird. And she runs into Mila's grieving boyfriend and he's like, she thought you were creepy. She didn't you like that. And I just want to smack that through the screen. I'm just so devastated because if Mila couldn't survive, then what is the hope for any of the rest of us?
Now that she's gone, she couldn't beat this. What hope do the rest of us have?
I'm like, you don't have cancer. But it could be true that she's just crying about something completely different entirely because, again, in fact, this was around the time that she would be exposed and she knew it. Anyway, as for the show, I think it's pretty good. I do think it's pretty good. I think maybe one of the things that would probably leave a bad taste in some people's mouths is in an effort to give Belle a more well-rounded character. There are some moments that can, I guess, come off as a bit redemptive or sympathetic for Belle. But honestly, I just think that is a fair deduction of Belle as a person. Like, again, you don't do shit that Belle Gibson does without being pitifully and painfully insecure. Like, a well-adjusted person doesn't have to create fabricated stories of near death to get attention from strangers to uplift their self-esteem. Like, mentally well people don't have to do that shit. And so that would insinuate something really sad and concerning there about Belle. And there are moments in the show that I think does a good job about how the way she is as a person doesn't just exist in a vacuum, right? It's because of a lot of factors, some of which are her decisions, but some of it is maybe how she grew up. And some of it does affect her partners or affects her son. One of the things that I think is very interesting is that they have a part where her son in the show, I don't know if this is like a real life thing at all, but the son in the show, she pretty much neglects him the entire show. Like, she's always working, she's always doing something. He always wants to see her and she's constantly like shooing him away. But at the end of the show, she notices that he has wrapped his arm up, claiming to have broken his arm. And it's just an example of that continuation of the vying for attention from a caretaker, from a parental figure, by lying about being unwell. And in that moment, this version of Belle has such a level of clarity and remorse towards her son that she's able to stop and really let him know that he doesn't have to do that. And I thought that was a very powerful scene. I don't know if Belle would have, in real life, would have that capacity, but it was great for a moment. I started crying in the show. I was like, huh. But even with scenes like that, I don't think it takes away from the frustration and disgust and sadness that I feel about real Belle. Again, I assumed that real Belle has a lot of trauma going on. So for a show to illustrate some of the possibilities of what that could have been, just created a fuller character to watch in a scripted show, in my opinion. But as always, I really wish people would go to therapy instead of lying about cancer for attention. I do think it's interesting how they wrote the mother in this scripted show, because they do make her explicitly self-centered and negligent. Again, it works for the narrative. The actual relationship between Belle and her deceased mother is a little bit more murky. We don't really know a whole lot. Again, I look at her sideways for letting her daughter live with a random man down the street. Weird. Very confusing. That was weird. That was gross. Anyway, but yeah, I could talk more about the show. I could go on forever, but for the sake of brevity, I'm gonna leave that there and get back to in real life Belle, and ultimately kind of the conclusion of this. Again, she would be found guilty of charity fraud and told to pay $410,000, which she has not paid a dime of since she was ordered to do so about 7 years ago. Again, she would claim that she is too poor to pay that money, even though there's a bunch of evidence of her going on luxury vacations and gambling and investing in cryptocurrency, but she don't have a dime to give back in restitution. Anyway, she also hasn't really apologized either. She's just said, I'm sorry that people were misled like me, and girl, shut the up. Anyway. Instead, it's just, again, a continuation of those weird and nonsensical excuses. And she lays low for the most part, but being that her name is up in conversation again, I'm sure she gets some form of sick fulfillment out of this. I don't know. The last notable thing she had done was a few years ago. She popped up in the Ethiopian community, claiming that her name was Sabontu, claiming that she was adopted by the community. Why not? That makes about as much sense as anything else that is happening. Yeah, her luxury trips, she's taken some trips over to Kenya and Ethiopia. I don't know if she's become particularly religious. That tends to be the way that people go. They find God in some font. Usually Christian, or they become Muslim, because those communities are very welcoming to converters usually. But they often are just as terrible as they've always been. But now they wear a hijab and call it a day. If I had a nickel for every grifter that I found that suddenly became a Muslim, I would have more than enough to buy a jawbreaker. Anyway, but yeah, that's the story. And some, not all at all. Again, I could go so long talking about my thoughts around apple cider vinegar and the story of Belle Gibson in general. If you guys are familiar with the story or just learning about it here today, or whatever comments and thoughts and opinions you want to do, feel free to put those down in the comment section. What were your thoughts on the show? I liked it. I could also see a reading in which people would not like it, particularly because of tonal things, but I want to know your opinions about it. I'm curious. I hope you guys guys are doing well. It's starting to get warm. I hope you guys are starting to get out of your seasonal depression cocoons.
My seasonally depressed baddies, don't kill yourself yet. The weather's coming back, bitch. You can't go to brunch if you're dead.
I hope you guys have had a good one. Feel free to follow me on Instagram or Bluesky, both of which are KennieJD. And I will see you guys next time.